Okay, so let's dive into the second half of this discussion. And we had finished a close reading on the first paragraph here. And so we're going to dive into the rest of the birthmark, and we're going to look at feminism and tie it all together. So, such a union accordingly took place and was attended with truly remarkable consequences and a deeply impressive moral. One day, very soon after their marriage, Elmer sat gazing at his wife with a trouble in his countenance that grew stronger until he spoke. So, trouble in his countenance, basically a troubled look, right? A look of concern. Georgiana, said he, has it never occurred to you that the mark upon your cheek might be removed? And so, knowing what you know about the story, just imagine asking your significant other about this. You know that birthmark you have there on your cheek? Yeah, have you ever thought of getting rid of that after having a troubled look on your face? Most of us, at least married men, know that that might not be the best way to pursue that. No, indeed, said she, smiling, but perceiving the seriousness of his manner, she blushed deeply. To tell you the truth, it's been so often called a charm that I was simple enough to imagine it might be so. Ah, upon another face, perhaps it might, replied her husband, but never on yours. No, dearest Georgiana, you came so nearly perfect from the hand of nature that the slightest possible defect, which we hesitate whether to term a defect or a beauty, shocks me as being the visible mark of earthly imperfection. So again, imagine, oh, wife, I love you so much, but you know that birthmark, man, it shocks me so much. I'm so troubled by it. Just the cluelessness here is quite shocking. But also, you start to think of transcendentalism as you're thinking as we're going through this part of the text, right? Perfect from the hand of nature. Shocks you, my husband, cried Georgiana, deeply hurt, at first reddening with momentary anger, but then bursting into tears. Then why did you take me from my mother's side? You can't love what shocks you, right? Good question, I think. But actually, if you look at this symbolically, what the birthmark represents, it could represent almost anything in the relationship or in a marriage or any close friendship or anything. That at first, the thing that you felt was charming about your significant other, over time, might not wear quite as well, right? This habit that your significant other has that you're like, oh, that's so wonderful. I'm so in love. It's so magical. I love that she does this. Well, at some point, 2, 3, 5 years into your marriage, you might be like, oh man, if she does this one more time, I am just going to explode, right? Okay, so its shape bore not a little similarity to the birthmark, similarity to the human hand, though the smallest pygmy size. Georgiana's lovers were wont to say that some fairy at her birth hour had laid her tiny hand upon the infant's cheek and left this impression there in token of the magic endowments that were to give her such sway over all hearts. Okay, so again, that it's magical. Now, the fact that it's shaped like a hand is interesting. That it's almost like a symbol of being human, right? But it would be as reasonable to say that one of those small blue stains which sometimes occur in the purest statuary marble would convert the Eve of powers to a monster. Again, a monster, shocked, appalled, troubled, right? Masculine observers, if the birthmark did not heighten their admiration, contented themselves with wishing it away, that the world might possess one living specimen of ideal loveliness without semblance of a flaw. Okay, now, an Eve, And so a first woman of power to a monster. Okay, so she's called a monster. She's called a specimen, shocked, right? So what's happening here is she's being objectified, right? So we're going to come back and look at that a little more with the discussion of feminism. But we see early on she's being objectified. The crimson hand expressed the ineludible gripe in which mortality clutches the highest and purest of earthly mold, degrading them into kindred with the lowest, and even with the very brutes, like whom their visible frames return to dust. So that's a symbol of humanity, a symbol of our mortality. That viewing imperfection reminds us that the world's not perfect, that we will die one day. In this manner, selecting it as the symbol of his wife's liability to sin, sorrow, decay, and death, Elmer's somber imagination was not long in rendering the birthmark a frightful object, causing him more trouble and horror than ever Georgiana's beauty, whether of soul or sense had given him delight. Okay, so we get very few, at least in the early part of the story, insights into how Elmer looks, whether he's attractive or has any imperfections, right? So the entire story so far is focused on her and a, depending on perspective, imperfection. With the morning twilight, Elmer opened his eyes upon his wife's face and recognized the symbol of imperfection. And when they sat together at the evening hearth, his eyes wandered stealthily to her cheek, and beheld, flickering with the blaze of the wood fire, the spectral hand that wrote mortality, where he would fain have worshipped. Notice the past tense there, would have worshipped. So he's no longer worshiping her the way he was. Georgiana soon learned to shudder at his gaze. Okay, so now at the time Hawthorne was writing this, the term gaze was not as loaded as it is now. Now it is a loaded term that feminist critics would zoom in on. So let's pull out for a moment and look at what we've seen so far and what we're going to see in the rest of the text through the lens of feminism. So feminist criticism is concerned with the ways in which literature and other cultural productions reinforce or undermine the economic, political, social, and psychological oppression of women. Okay, so some questions you might ask, and there's a ton of them that can help you understand a feminist perspective on on literature. If this was the only text available to understand women, what would we think about them based on this perspective? How would the story be different if genders were flipped between Elmer and Georgiana here? So if Georgiana was focused on a birthmark of Elmer's, how would this be different? Matter of fact, I would argue it often, especially in that society, but even to a point in today's society, it would be hard to imagine that story, right? That almost always that's a focus that we have on women rather than men. You often see, let me skip that. Other questions, how are relationships between men and women portrayed? What are the power relationships? Who's has power in each relationship? Are all the people who have jobs, are they all male, right? Do they all act a certain way? Same with female. How are male and female roles defined? What constitutes masculinity and femininity? So if this piece of literature, if you had to define how they view masculinity or femininity, how would you define it? How do characters embody these traits? Or do they defy them? Do characters take on traits from opposite genders? How so? How does this change others' reactions to them? And so this is something that you'll see in more literature that we look at, and what happens to characters who defy gender roles. What does the work reveal about operations of patriarchy? So about those power structures, how can we understand those better based in this literature? What does the work imply about the possibilities of sisterhood as a mode of resistance? So at its very heart, it's basically saying, does it at all imply that women can unite to resist these pressures? What does the work say about women's creativity? What does the history of the work's reception by the public and by critics tell us about the operation of patriarchy? So if people read the Birthmark differently now than they did 100 years ago, what can we learn about how society has changed? What role did the work play in terms of women's literary history and literary tradition? Right. Okay. Now, I paused at the word gaze and said, in Hawthorne's time, it didn't have the power that it has now from the feminist perspective. That there's entire parts of theory that focus in on the male gaze. The male gaze is a concept coined by feminist film critic Laura Mulvey. It refers to the way visual arts are structured around a masculine viewer. It describes a tendency in visual culture to depict the world and women from a masculine point of view and in terms of men's attitude. So in other words, if we are watching a film of nearly any kind, the vast majority of creative and artistic directors of those films are men. So how does this shape the perspective of the film? And because of that, how does it change culture, right? The male gaze occurs when the camera puts the audience in the perspective of a heterosexual man. It may linger over the curves of a woman's body, for instance. The woman is usually displayed on two different levels, as an erotic object for both the characters within the film and as an object for the spectator who's watching the film. Okay, so this is very particular to film, right? But it's translated into everything from literature to pop culture, right? So the West in particular and America as an epitome of it, we objectify women. I have a lot of friends, and this will attach to the cartoon that I included here. My wife works with international students, so I have many, many, many friends from other parts of the world. And what's always striking to me is how parts of my culture are made visible just by spending time with people from another culture. So when I have friends from the Middle East come to town and say I need to pick them up from the airport, well, I've picked up many friends who maybe it was their first time in the U.S. So maybe they weren't friends yet, but eventually would become friends. And so their first time in the U.S. on the way from the airport, I always kind of keep a corner of my eye looking at them and their reaction to advertisements, right? So we're driving along the highway, and as an American, most advertisements and most displays become kind of background and we don't think about them. But it all becomes heightened when you're with somebody who's new to your culture. And so all of a sudden you realize there's a nearly naked woman every couple hundred feet from the airport to, well, in my case, Indiana, Pennsylvania, right? And you become very sensitized to that and realize our culture objectifies women just about so thoroughly that it's in our subconscious. We relegate it to our subconscious and don't often think about how widely we objectify them. And that's problematic in that in studies of genocide, they found the first step towards violence is objectification. that it's incredibly hard to commit violence against somebody you view as a fellow human, that you see the humanity in. But once you objectify them, it is extremely easy to slip towards violence. And we have a lot of problems with violence against women and spousal violence. And so objectification plays a large role in that. And just that cartoon, I've used this idea many times in my courses that I have a friend from Jordan who used to come in and speak to classes quite often. And the first thing she would say is, she'd go, "American women are so oppressed." And everyone would be looking at her because she covers her head. She wears a hijab. And she'd go, "American women are so oppressed." And she'd repeat it a couple of times. And she'd go, "Why do you think I say that?" And sometimes students would get it right away and sometimes not. And keep in mind, this is from her perspective. I'm not saying I agree with every part of it, but it's from her perspective. And she'd say, so American women, from the moment they're born, all the way through Disney movies, to pop culture, to billboards, to social, are pressured to look and act in certain manners. Now, women can resist that pressure, but they are pressured. If you can watch on YouTube super clips of women sexualized in Disney cartoons, and it's actually quite striking. And so she says, from the moment you're born, you're pressured to wear little clothing, to be curvy, to wear makeup, to possibly get plastic surgery. And she would argue that much of a social pressure and objectification, she from her perspective, is more oppressive than the pressure to cover your head. And she would make her point and say, well, I think that's a good place to leave that. So it gives you the power of the male gaze. And so feminists would want to look for this gaze in literature and how are women presented. Okay. And this is just to the point I was saying before, that our society is extremely based in this. Women only make up 16% of leadership or artistic roles in Hollywood, 3% of all advertising directors. So 97% of our advertising, I know I'm presenting that a little weird, but comes through the lens of male, right? And so the way we see women in our culture is through a male lens. And this is the same with literature, right? And so it creates problems. 53%, you can see huge percentages of women are unhappy with their bodies. There's self-injury, there's eating disorders, there's rates of depression among women and young girls have doubled over the past decade. Cosmetic procedures have tripled among youth. And there's almost 15 million people cut up their bodies to change them for cosmetic purposes yearly. And the vast majority are women. So these pressures have real effects. Let's come back to this. Let's dive back to the text, and then we'll come back to this idea of the mad woman in the attic. Another feminist idea. Okay, so we left Georgiana soon learned to shudder at his gaze. That is something that feminists could write volumes on, that his gaze is so powerful that it affects her at her core. It is in her heart now. We must have it out. Okay, so the fact that her birthmark is dreaded, is horrific, is in her heart, and we must get rid of it. Elmer now remembered his dream. He had fancied himself with his servant Aminadab, attempting an operation for the removal of the birthmark, but the deeper went the knife, the deeper sank the hand, until at length its tiny grasp appeared to have caught hold of Georgiana's heart, whence, however, her husband was inexorably resolved to cut or wrench it away. Okay, so hopefully by this point in the semester, this rings some bells. What literary term does this remind you of? I'll give it here, but because we don't have the dialogue going here, but you'll want to look for this as you're reading text. It's foreshadowing. It's the idea that he has a dream that this is going to turn out bad. And by the way, again, Hawthorne just hits you over the head with it. He doesn't hold any punches. He doesn't try to hide it or make it subtle. He hits you over the head with it. Elmer, resumed Georgiana solemnly, I know not what may be the cost to both of us to rid me of this fatal birthmark. Perhaps its removal may cause cureless deformity, or it may be the stain goes as deep as life itself. Again, do we know that there is a possibility on any terms of unclasping the firm grip of this little hand, which was laid upon me before I came into the world? Dearest Georgiana, I have spent much thought on this subject, hastily interrupted Elmer. I'm convinced of the perfect practicability of its removal. Okay, so it's showing him as the person who has power. Again, from a feminist lens, this is something we can investigate. Who has the power? Who's using the power? How it's presented? And so it's also showing the privilege of the science over beauty, right? Showing that that's privileged in this story. If there be the remotest possibility of it, continued Georgiana, let the attempt be made at whatever risk. Danger is nothing to me, for life, while this hateful mark makes me the object of your horror disgust, life is a burden which I would fling down with joy. Either remove this dreadful hand or take my wretched life. Okay, again, from a feminist reading, this hateful mark makes me the object, right? So literal objectification, or I'm sorry, that's a bad way of phrasing it. But he's outright saying that I am objecting, or she's being made into an object. Okay, I think I finally got that there. I was battling my words a bit there. She's being objectified in this text, to put it simply. And so much so that she would rather die than not to be an object of desire. You have deep science. All the world bears witness of it. You have achieved great wonders. Cannot you remove this little mark, which I cover with the tips of my 2 small fingers? Is this beyond your power, for the sake of your own peace, and to save your poor wife from madness? Okay, we'll see this a little bit more as we go along, but this gets to another feminist theme. The Mad Woman and the Addict, a book explores this theme. The Mad Woman and the Attic, published in 1979, examines Victorian literature from a feminist perspective. Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gabar draw their title from Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, in which Rochester's wife Bertha Mason is kept locked in the attic by her husband. In the work, Gilbert and Gubar examine the notion that writers are confined in their writing to make their female characters either embody the angel or the monster, the Madonna or whore, or other binaries. And so again, think binary opposition here. This struggle stemmed from male writers' tendency to categorize female characters as either pure angelic women or rebellious, unkept mad women. Because this became a dominant tendency in Western culture, women often categorize themselves in this way. And so think of this when you have the vast majority of Hollywood films being written by men, advertising written by men, books being published by men. It creates such a dominance, right? And so I heard a director once say on this that it's not that men are trying to portray women this way or that there's some evil intent. The vast majority of time, that's not the case. Instead, it's men don't understand women, right? Very few of us are going to ever understand women. As a man, I can say that. And because we don't understand them, we need to put them in boxes, okay? And so most often it's a simple, and it comes off as a flat character. An angel, like Georgiana, right? A flat character, an angel, or a monster, or you have the super nice or the bitchy woman, right? You have the aggressive woman or the submissive woman, right? You have the sexually permissive or the virgin, right? So Georgiana very clearly is written from this perspective. Let's dive back into the text. And matter of fact, so she's so clearly into this perspective that she says, if I can't be on the good side of that binary, I will just go into madness and you might as well kill me. Georgiana, you have led me deeper than ever into the heart of science. I feel myself fully competent to render this dear cheek as faultless as its fellow. And then, most beloved, what will be my triumph when I shall have corrected what nature left imperfect in her fairest work? Even Pygmalion, when his sculptured woman assumed life, felt not greater ecstasy than will be mine. Okay, so now think of the relationship to this to transcendentalism, right? So he's saying he's going to correct nature. Well, this is the opposite of transcendentalism. Transcendentalism says nature is perfect. It's man and society that corrupts. And so from a transcendentalist perspective, the foreshadowing here is pretty obvious. It's going to end up in disaster. But let's just explain what this reference to Pygmalion is, right? And then we'll come back to the text. So, let me skip a little forward here. There we go. In Ovid's narrative, Pygmalion was a sculptor who carved a woman out of ivory. According to Ovid, he was not interested in women, but his statue was so fair and realistic that he fell in love with it. In time, Aphrodite's festival day came, the goddess Aphrodite, and Pygmalion made offerings at the altar of Aphrodite. There, too scared to admit his desire, he quietly wished for a bride who would be the living likeness of my ivory girl. When he returned home, he kissed his ivory statue and found that its lips felt warm. He kissed again and found that the ivory had lost its hardness. Aphrodite had granted Pygmalion's wish. Pygmalion married the ivory sculpture, changed to a woman under Aphrodite's blessing. In Ovid's narrative, they had a son Paphos, from whom the city's name is derived. So think of why he might use this, right? And this relates to how women respond to the male gaze, right? To respond to objectification, respond to be put into some simplistic boxes and objectified. And that often when people treat us in a certain way, there's something called the Pygmalion effect, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we start acting in that way. That doesn't seem right. Like we want to say, no, we would rebel against that. But the psychological tendency is that when people treat us in a certain way, we start acting that way. An example of this, there was an experiment in teaching where they sent a teacher students who were all of the same level, and they were told a third of them were remedial students, a third of them were gifted students, and a third of them were average. And their each name was put in one of those three categories. And in reality, all of the students were on equal footing. By the end of 1 year, it was over 90% of those students fulfilled the category they were in. those labeled remedial ended up being remedial. Those labeled gifted ended up being gifted. Okay. And so it's not just that the students fulfill the roles, but the teacher does as well. So if a teacher views two students, and so we try to work against this, but it's human nature. If I view one student as gifted and one as remedial, and say both students turn in a homework assignment and it's missing one question or one answer, right? And if both of them turn in four, it's supposed to be 4 questions and both turn in 3. Well, studies have shown the teacher's more likely to say, hey, gifted student, you forgot one answer. Could you resubmit? And to tell the remedial student, oh, you forgot one answer. You get 3 out of 4 on this assignment, right? And so there's a self-fulfilling prophecy here. So when Elmer so strongly feels that that Georgiana is imperfect, well, she begins embodying his feelings. So let's go back to the text. As he led her over the threshold of the laboratory, Georgiana was cold and tremulous. Okay, so this is a weird phrasing. Threshold of the laboratory. When we think of being led over the threshold, it's often part of the wedding ceremony, right? So he's saying, instead of carrying her over as part of a wedding ceremony, he's taking her into the laboratory as a wedding ceremony. So a new marriage, a new union. Elmer looked her cheerfully in the face with intent to reassure her, but was so startled with the intense glow of the birthmark upon the whiteness of her cheek that he could not restrain a strong, convulsive shudder. His wife fainted. Aminadab, shouted Elmer, stamping violently on the floor. Forthwith there issued from an inner apartment a man of low stature, but bulky frame, with his shaggy hair hanging about his visage, which was grimed with the vapors of the furnace. This personage had been Elmer's underworker during his whole scientific career, and was admirably fitted for that office by his great mechanical readiness, and the skill with which, while incapable of comprehending a single principle, he executed all the details of his master's experiments. With his vast strength, his shaggy hair, his smoky aspect, and the indescribable earthiness that encrusted him, he seemed to represent man's physical nature, while Elmer's slender figure and pale intellectual face were no less apt a type of spiritual element. Okay, so let's look at how Aminadab is presented and think of what he could be symbolic of. Okay, so he's bulky, low stature, shaggy hair, kind of hunched posture, right? Grimed from the furnace. He's servile. He's there to serve, and he's not very smart, incapable of comprehending. He's strong, shaggy hair, smoky, so darker skin, earthiness, and the opposite of Elmer, right? So this is a man who is a closer to earth, closer to the natural world, closer to almost ape-like, right? Now, you could definitely do a study of this and look at it as far as racial construction and view this as a racist description, that perhaps it's a view of race that is not very good. But we don't know that. It seems like that a bit. But so Aminadab is more animal-like, but closer to nature, right? And so remember, in transcendentalist thought, that's a good thing. Yes, master, answered Aminadab, looking intently at the lifeless form of Georgiana, and then he muttered, right, almost prelingual. If she were my wife, I'd never part with that birthmark, right? So the person closer to nature saying, treasure that birthmark, right? So basically there's a big transcendentalist idea here that society is causing him to destroy this beautiful woman. Elmer had converted those smoky, dingy, somber rooms where he'd spent his brightest years in pursuits into a series of beautiful apartments not unfit to be the secluded abode of a lovely woman. So he changed his laboratory into a beautiful place, or at least, a man's version of what's beautiful, a man of science. The walls were hung with gorgeous curtains, which imparted the combination of grandeur and grace that no other species of adornment can achieve, and as they fell from the ceiling to the floor, the rich and ponderous folds, concealing all angles and straight lines, appeared to shut in the scene from infinite space. For aught Georgiana knew, it might be a pavilion among the clouds. So he's converted his laboratory into a more welcoming place. When wearied of this, Elmer bade her cast her eyes upon a vessel containing a quantity of earth. She did so with little interest at first, but was soon startled to perceive the germ of a plant shooting upward from the soil. Then came the slender stalk. The leaves gradually unfolded themselves, and amid them was a perfect and lovely flower. Okay, so you want to think we're getting a little piece of nature here. So you want to think naturalism. How does it parallel or defy the story? It's magical, cried Georgiana. I dare not touch it. Nay, pluck it, answered Elmer. Pluck it and inhale its brief perfume while you may. The flower will wither in a few moments and leave nothing save its brown seed vessels, but thence may be perpetuated as a race as ephemeral as itself. Okay, so Georgiana's like, no, leave it alone. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. And he's saying, no, pluck it and take it for all it's worth, right? So it's kind of a take this type mindset. But Georgiana had no sooner touched the flower than the whole plant suffered a blight, its leaves turning coal black as if by the agency of fire, right? Again, your alarm bells should be ringing with foreshadowing. So this flower is symbolic of human control over nature leads to death. There was too powerful a stimulus, said Elmer thoughtfully. To make up for this abortive experiment, he proposed to take her portrait by a scientific process of his own invention. It was to be effected by rays of light striking upon a polished plate of metal, so an old form of photography. Georgiana assented, but on looking at the result was affrighted to find the features of the portrait blurred and indefinable, while the minute figure of a hand appeared where the cheek should have been. Elmer snatched the metallic plate and threw it into a jar of corrosive acid. So once again, symbolic foreshadowing. That man trying to capture beauty turns into disaster and destroys it. So knowing all that without knowing the end of the story, you should know that it's not going to turn out well at this point, if just from knowing to look for foreshadowing. At the mention of the birthmark, Georgiana, as usual, shrank as if a red-hot iron had touched her cheek. Again, Elmer applied himself to his labors. She could hear his voice in the distant furnace rooms, giving directions to Aminadab, that's hard to say, whose harsh, uncouth, misshapen tones were audible in response, more like the grunt or growl of a brute than human speech. Again, animal-like, closer to nature, good from a transcendentalist point of view. Still, whenever she dared to look into the mirror, there she beheld herself pale as a white rose, and with the crimson birthmark stamped upon her cheek. Not even Elmer hated it so much as she. So from a feminist perspective, she's now internalized the male gaze, internalized objectification, internalized hatred of herself. They were the works of philosophers in the Middle Ages, such as Albertus Magnus, Cornelius Agrippa, Paracelsus, and the famous friar who created the prophetic brazen head. All these antique naturalists stood in advance of their centuries, yet he's talking about books on a shelf, yet were imbued with some of their credulity and therefore were believed and perhaps imagined themselves to have acquired from the investigation of nature a power above nature and from physics a sway over the spiritual world. Okay, so all these books, this is a great symbolic way of saying all of human history, all these great men have tried to make a power above nature, and all have failed, right? And again, it's some foreshadowing. The volume rich with achievements that had won renown for its author, so a book that Elmer had wrote, was yet as melancholy a record as ever mortal hand had penned. It was the sad confession and continual exemplification of the shortcomings of the composite man, the spirit burdened with clay and working in matter, and of the despair that assails the higher nature at finding itself so miserably thwarted by the earthly part. Perhaps every man of genius in whatever sphere might recognize the image of his own experience in Elmer's journal. So here is criticism of kind of the great man theory of history, this idea that we stand on the shoulders of giants and saying they've all failed, and if you look at their writings, there's faults in all of them. "It has made me worship you more than ever," said she. "Ah, wait for this one success," rejoined he, "then worship me if you will. I shall deem himself hardly unworthy of it. But come, I have sought you for the luxury of your voice. Oh, sing to me, dearest." "So made me worship you more than ever," said she. Again, from a feminist perspective, the female worshiping the male, that's a power structure that should be paid attention to. But what chiefly, indeed almost solely, drew her attention was the aspect of Elmer himself. He was pale as death, anxious and absorbed, and hung over the furnace as if it depended upon his utmost watchfulness whether the liquid which it was distilling should be draught of immortal happiness or misery. How different from the sanguine and joyous mien that he had assumed for Georgiana's encouragement. The potion that's going to get rid of the birthmark. "Carefully now, Aminadab, there we go. Carefully, there should be an outtake reel to this thing. "Carefully, thou human machine, carefully, thou man of clay," muttered Elmer, more to himself than his assistant. "Now, if there be a thought too much, too little, it's all over." "Ho, ho," mumbled Aminadab. "Look, master, look." Again, he's closer to nature than Elmer. "I submit," replied she calmly. Submit is another signal word for feminist theory. It's part of the marriage process that a woman is supposed to submit to a man in traditional marriage, at least in the Western Abrahamic religions. And so power relationships would be looked at again there. "And Elmer, I shall quaff whatever draught you bring me, but it will be on the same principle that will induce me to take a dose of poison if offered by your hand." So she's willing to poison herself to get rid of the horror that she's internalized. "Danger? There's but one danger, that this horrible stigma shall be left upon my cheek," cried Georgiana. Remove it, whatever be the cost, or we shall both go mad." Again, second mention of madness. I believe there's another one too. This idea that women who strive for perfection through the male gaze will drive themselves into madness. It's also another way that it's viewed in feminist theory is that women can't be perfectly fit into one of either binary, and men can only view them in that way, so they will appear mad. The complexity of women and the full nature of women, men will never be able to make sense of, and so they will be viewed as man. Matter of fact, the term hysteria or hysterical, its root is from the Greek word for womb, right? And so it's viewed that women are the heart of madness, right? So we always want to pay attention to things like insanity and madness and how they're used in a text, especially in regards to gender. Unless all my science has deceived me, this cannot fail. But we've just built up a whole list of foreshadowing clues that it's going to fail. Drink then, thou lofty creature. Okay, so again, not objectified here, but made into a creature, right? Exclaimed Aylmer with fervid admiration, there is no taint of imperfection on thy spirit. Thy sensible frame, too, shall soon be perfect. Now the minutest symptom escaped him, a heightened flush of a cheek, a slight irregularity of a breath, a quiver of an eyelid, a hardly perceptible tremor through the frame. Such were the details which, as the moments passed, he wrote down in his volume. So he writes down every single change in her. Georgiana, out of the midst of her deep sleep, moved uneasily and murmured as if in remonstrance. In literature studies, this would be symbolic death and rebirth. She's symbolically dead, and then she's reborn in the image of Aylmer. She remained not less pale than ever, but the birthmark, with every breath that came and went, lost somewhat of its former distinctness. Its presence had been awful, its departure was more awful still. Watch the stain of the rainbow fading from the sky, and you'll know how that mysterious symbol passed away. By heaven, it is well nigh gone, said Aylmer to himself, an almost irrepressible ecstasy. So he's thrilled of this perfection that he's made. I can scarcely trace it now. Success, success, and now it is like the faintest rose color. The lightest flush of blood across her cheek would overcome it, but she's so pale. He drew aside the window curtain and suffered the light of natural day to fall into the room and rest upon her cheek. At the same time, he heard a gross, hoarse chuckle, which he had long known as the servant Aminadab's expression of delight. Okay, so I want you to think about why Aminadab might be delighted here. Ah, Claude, a earthly mass, cried Aylmer, laughing in a sort of frenzy. You have served me well. Matter of spirit, earth, and heaven have both done their part in this. Laugh, thing of the senses. So of the senses, closer to nature, you have earned the right to laugh. These exclamations broke Georgiana's sleep. She slowly unclosed her eyes and gazed into the mirror, which her husband had arranged for that purpose. A faint smile flitted over her lips when she recognized how barely perceptible was now the crimson hand which had once blazed forth with such disastrous brilliancy as to scare away all their happiness. But then her eyes sought Aylmer's face with a trouble and anxiety that he could by no means account for. My poor Aylmer, murmured she. Poor? Nay, richest, happiest, most favored, exclaimed he. My peerless bride is successful. You are perfect. My poor Aylmer, she repeated with a more than human tenderness. You have aimed loftily. You have done nobly. Do not repent that with so high and pure a feeling you have rejected the best that earth could offer. Aylmer, dearest Aylmer, I'm dying. Alas, it was too true. The fatal hand had grappled with the mystery of life, and was the bond by which the angelic spirit itself in union with mortal frame. As the last crimson tint of the birthmark, the sole token of human imperfection, faded from her cheek, the parting breath of the now perfect woman passed into the atmosphere, and her soul, lingering a moment near her husband, took its heavenward flight. So returned to nature, returned to spiritual world. Then a hoarse, chuckling laugh was heard again. Thus ever does the gross fatality of earth exult in its invariable triumph over the immortal essence which, in this dim sphere of half-development, demands the completeness of a higher state. So, why is Aminadab laughing here? And he says, earth exalts. Aminadab is closer to earth, exalts. Why? Because it's receiving its gift back. It's receiving Georgiana, this perfect, beautiful nature back and taking it back. That's why Aminadab is laughing. Yet had Elmer reached a profounder wisdom, he need not thus have flung away the happiness which have woven his mortal life of the self-same texture with the celestial. The momentary circumstance was too strong for him. He failed to look beyond the shadowy scope of time, and living once for all in eternity to find the perfect future in the present. Okay, so I want you to, in closing here, I want you to think about what sorts of messages this conveys. What could we learn from a feminist perspective? What could we learn about science? What could we learn about trying to transform nature? What could we learn about objectification, about the male gaze, about women existing in a patriarchal world? All of those and many more are bigger ideas that this short story reaches towards. And not all of them are things Hawthorne meant to, right? I'm sure he definitely wasn't aware of the idea of the male gaze or many of the feminist theories. But we can still learn those things from this text. We can learn how the patriarchy operates through this text. We can learn how to interpret it and how our culture works by interpreting it in this way. Okay, so I'm going to tie it up there. And you can now take the quiz on the two parts of this discussion. Thanks, and I'll talk to you soon.